Among the many sinister foes faced by the heroes of Middle-earth, the Nazgul are perhaps the most visually striking and fear-inspiring of all those who came into the service of the Dark Lord Sauron. In this video, I'd like to talk about how the Nazgul came to be, to recap their activity before the events of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and to highlight some of the powers and abilities that contributed to their fearful reputation. Almost halfway through the Second Age, after the elf prince Celebrimbor forged the 19 Rings of Power in Eregion, and upon Sauron's creation of the One Ring to rule them all, the elves realized Sauron's betrayal, reacting by locking the rings away in Eregion, prompting Sauron to confront the elves in open war. This war resulted in Sauron's successful reclamation of the rings. His original plan had been to bring the elven ring-bearers under his influence. Because the elves were able to detect his evil intentions, he then turned his attention to the lesser beings of Middle-earth. Subsequently, he distributed 9 of the Rings of Power to great lords and warriors of men. 3 of them were great lords of the Númenórean race. Sauron's ability to mislead and entrap the Númenóreans played a major role in the kingdom's eventual downfall. So the fact that at least a third of the Nazgul came from the island of Númenor serves as evidence of Sauron's crafty designs and his keen awareness of how to exploit mankind's desire for power and knowledge. Additionally, because Sauron had previously spent a large amount of time amassing a following from eastern and southern men, it comes as no surprise that one of the 9 was also an Easterling king, Camul, who was the second most powerful of the 9 and the only one that was ever named aside from the Lord of the Nazgul, the Witch King of Angmar, who received that title in the Third Age. Sauron's forging of the One Ring allowed him to dominate the other rings and corrupt these 9 mortals. The men who received these rings became sorcerers and used them in attaining great glory, power, and wealth. One feature of their rings was that any mortal who wore them was granted a lifespan far beyond their natural one. It's possible that this was an unintended side effect, as Sauron originally meant for these rings to be worn by elves, who are themselves immortal. Regardless of the intention, the rings caused the lives of the 9 to be prolonged, and allowed them to peer into and see objects and creatures of the spirit world known as the unseen. In time, however, life became unendurable to the 9, and whenever they would put the rings on, they would see the phantoms and delusions of Sauron. The rings made their bearers invisible to all except for those who could see into the Wraith world, and slowly, one by one, depending on each of the 9's native strength and willpower to resist evil, they eventually fell into the shadows, becoming slaves under the domination of Sauron's One Ring. They became forever invisible except to the eyes of the One Ring's wielder, wraiths who only did the Dark Lord's bidding. The 9 were first seen around 2251 of the Second Age, and soon thereafter became Sauron's foremost servants. Interestingly, the power and abilities of the 9 were tied to and were either enhanced or diminished by the strength and might of Sauron himself. As such, after Sauron's defeat at the end of the Second Age in the War of the Last Alliance, they were temporarily dispersed. But because of the Dark Lord's influence over them through the One Ring, both the Nazgul and Sauron were able to endure and live on as long as the ring survived. When considering the different abilities of the Ringwraiths, the Witch King is perhaps the most impressive, as he is said to have been the most difficult to slay. This stems from the fact that any weapon that struck him would be destroyed, and its bearer would subsequently be poisoned. The Nazgul were known to carry long swords of steel and flame, venomous daggers, and poisonous darts, with the Witch King additionally possessing a mighty black mace able to shatter shields and kill enemies with a single blow. Along with enhanced senses of hearing and smell, the 9 also had powerful voices, which were used to instill dread and terror into the hearts and minds of mortals. The Nazgul were also surrounded by a toxic aura of terror referred to as the Black Breath. This could cause any who lingered in their vicinity to be disoriented and fall ill, with intense exposure potentially being lethal. As such, only specially trained horses or the fell beasts of Mordor could carry them. There were several heroes of Middle-earth who could resist the Nazgul's aura of dread and were able to successfully confront and drive back one of these foes. However, only a few could survive being confronted by all 9 at the same time. As his name suggests, the Witch King stands among the 9 as the most powerful sorcerer, able to greatly affect matter in the physical world, as was made evident in his breaking Frodo's sword with a wave of his hand and his weakening of the gates of Minas Tirith, which allowed them to be breached. The Ringwraiths generally had poor vision in the physical world, but they were highly aware of the beings with a presence in the Wraith world, such as the wearer of the One Ring and certain elves. Anyone who was able to look into the Wraith world could see the Nazgul as they had appeared in their mortal lives. With the exception of the Witch King of Angmar, none of the 9 could operate very well, nor were they apt to set out alone in the daylight, as they generally feared it. Also, apart from the Witch King, the Nazgul also maintained a fear of water, and except in dire need, they proved unwilling to enter into any body of water or cross over any stream that was not made passable by a bridge. In regards to their activities during the Second Age, other than their great power and position as weapons of Sauron's will, not much is known. Their actions during the War of the Last Alliance at the end of the Second Age are also unknown. Because their strength was tied so heavily to the will of Sauron, his defeat at the end of the Second Age resulted in a great diminishing of their power and abilities, as they disappeared into the shadows. For the first 1300 years of the Third Age, they remained unseen. The Witch King was the first of the 9 to be accounted for, as he established himself in Angmar, where he gained his title. From Angmar, the Witch King led Sauron's forces in several assaults, resulting in the destruction of the successor kingdoms of Arnor. In the 1975th year, the Witch King suffered a defeat, forcing him to flee and eventually return to Mordor. Nearly 2 decades later, the Witch King led the Ringwraiths in the siege of Minas Ithil, which would become Minas Morgul. This city would become a base of operations to facilitate the rebuilding of Sauron's armies. The siege of Minas Ithil marked the first recorded activity of the 9 Nazgul in the Third Age. Here, they remained dormant until the year 2951, when Sauron openly declared himself. Thereafter, they remained active, continuing to do the Dark Lord's bidding as he worked to once again rise to power, seeking to dominate the free peoples of Middle-earth. But I'm curious to know what you think of the Nazgul. Is there a particular moment in their history or aspect of their power that stands out the most to you? Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. I hope you enjoyed this video. Leave a like if you did, and be sure to subscribe for more Lord of the Rings and other sci-fi and fantasy news and lore. Thank you all so much for your support, and as always, have a very nerdy day.